our focus is a bill called the Landless legislation. It's also called the Five New Corporations Bill. And it's a very complicated piece of legislation, but the long and short of it is that Congress is currently actively considering a bill that would privatize 115,000 acres of public land from the Tongass National Forest. And that includes 80,000 acres of old growth forests and 60,000 acres of old growth forests that are protected by the roadless rule. So we're talking about, imagine the Olympic National Park type of forests. We are talking about old growth trees that are 8 to 10 feet thick in some cases and 500 to 1,000 years old. And we're talking about entire watersheds that have never been logged that the government is currently proposing to give to corporations.
Welcome, Wild Ones. I'm Josh Schlossberg, host of the Green Root Podcast, the official podcast of Eco Integrity Alliance, where we're on a quest to uncover the roots of the ecological crisis. This episode, our guest is Joshua Wright. Joshua Wright is the program director of the Legacy Forest Defense Coalition working in Southeast Alaska and Washington State. In his free time, he tracks the logging of old growth forests in British Columbia and works with lead researchers to protect endangered species living in threatened old growth forests. He was a part of the Fairy Creek blockade, which facilitated the largest active civil disobedience in Canadian history. Welcome to the Green Root Podcast, Joshua.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, as I was saying before, there are certain areas of the world that I have not been paying as close attention to, despite how important it is what's going on up there. And one of those areas is Alaska. So, tell us in so many words, what's going on in Alaska right now?
There are a lot of not so good things happening in Alaska. And the reason I spend a lot of my time focusing on Southeast Alaska is because if you think about the west coast of America, and the North American continent, all the way from California to basically Anchorage is what scientists call the North Pacific temperate rainforest. So the redwoods, Oregon, the coast of Vancouver Island, the Hoh rainforest, that's all part of the same ecosystem. And the southern reaches, pretty much everything in the lower 48, all of those intact old growth forests, for the most part, they've been cut or they've been protected. And, there are areas in limbo. But in British Columbia and even more so in Alaska, you still have very, very large scale old growth logging projects that happen. And this is the kind of logging that people just don't think happens anymore. So when I first went up to Alaska, I was 15 years old and I saw clear cuts that were 5,000 acres of old growth forest clear cut in one go. And that was a really, really radicalizing experience for me. And as somebody who is fighting for this rainforest, I live in Washington State. Um, you can't fight for this rainforest and ignore the areas that are at most peril and are the most important remaining areas. So right now, our focus is a bill called the Landless legislation. It's also called the Five New Corporations Bill. And it's a very complicated piece of legislation, but the long and short of it is that Congress is currently actively considering a bill that would privatize 115,000 acres of public land from the Tongass National Forest. And that includes 80,000 acres of old growth forests and 60,000 acres of old growth forests that are protected by the roadless rule. So we're talking about, imagine the Olympic National Park type of forests. We are talking about old growth trees that are 8 to 10 feet thick in some cases and 500 to 1,000 years old. And we're talking about entire watersheds that have never been logged that the government is currently proposing to give to corporations. And believe it or not, this bill is being supported by the Democratic leadership in the House of Representatives, as well as the Nature Conservancy and the Wilderness Society. And many regional environmental groups are mum on this legislation. They haven't said anything because there's quite a history to it. But right now, we went up to Alaska last year to start documenting these areas at risk of privatization. And I went up there working with a Tlingit activist named Wanda Culp, and I was joined by a filmmaker, and we went out to these areas and documented them. And There's a new film called Landless. So it's landlessfilm.com that you can watch for free that talks about this legislation and actually shows you the areas at risk of privatization. So that came out yesterday and it's available for a month. So people should go check that out. But it kind of goes into why we got here and how we got here. And the reason that so many entities are supporting this legislation is because it is using the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act as an excuse to give land to for-profit corporations. And I'll pause there, but I can explain exactly how we got here. Most people in the lower 48 have never heard of ANCSA, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, and just how supremely messed up it is. So that's something that I think more people need to know about.
Yeah, well, thanks for framing all this. And yeah, tell us, what is the Alaska Native Claim Settlement Act?
Yeah, the easiest way to think about it is in the lower 48, you had, Europeans who came in and stole the land, and you had treaties that were established, a lot of them under duress, but you had treaties where tribal governments, First Nations governments actually got land as reservations. And some of the reservations were tiny and some of them were huge, but they got land and these lands were governed by essentially sovereign nations in the lower 48. In in Alaska, when the US bought Alaska from Russia, it inherited the obligation to settle outstanding claims of Alaska natives. And instead of giving reservations to Alaska natives, they gave them shares in corporations. So in 1971, the government passed the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, and it created these regional and village corporations. And if you lived in a native community, you received shares in a village corporation and in a regional corporation. And that's who got the land, were these for-profit entities set up by Congress. And unlike tribal governments, they don't have any obligation to maximize, subsistence use or to consider the needs of the community beyond the financial needs. So what you had were these organizations given a little bit of cash and a lot of land, and it set up a resource boom where now you have some of these, we call them ANCSA corporations that are, they do mining, they do oil drilling, and in Southeast Alaska on the Tongass, they do logging. So the regional native corporation, Southeast Alaska, they have been responsible for the largest share of old growth logging historically, something like 300,000 acres that have been logged on their lands. And because they are private entities, they're regulated as corporations, as shareholder-owned corporations. They they only think about profit for shareholders, and they don't have to follow the same standards, as minimal as they are, that federal lands have to follow. So we're talking about, large creeks and rivers sometimes logged through. You're talking about lakes logged through. You're talking about shorelines logged. And now the landless legislation is being pushed under the guise of equity, because some communities that didn't meet the eligibility criteria to receive corporate status back in 1971 are now saying we were mistakenly left out of this bill and we want our bite at the apple too. And if that happens, Congress would essentially be opening up Pandora's box of new land claims by these corporations. And there's kind of a a default perspective that, oh, well, if it's native corporations getting this land, they will be managing the land with indigenous values. Has literally never happened because these corporations were set up as a colonial mechanism to facilitate resource extraction. And Wanda talks about this very powerfully in the film, how she never received land. Her story is a pretty amazing one because her brother was a CEO of one of these corporations, and she actually was living off grid, on her traditional territory on lands that she personally bought from the state of Alaska. But because she was living as a subsistence person, living off of the land in a very indigenous relationship to the land, she couldn't make the payments on her 5 acres, and the state repossessed it, and now she lives in Juneau. So when you think about giving land to Native people, she doesn't have any of that land. She doesn't have access to the land that she is a shareholder of. She gets dividends, and the CEO of the regional Native corporation makes 2 million bucks a year. So that's the system that's been set up. And because it's essentially an old growth logging bill. The bill talks about, use of log shipment facilities and cooperative use agreements to facilitate the resource extraction of these lands once they're privatized. Um, it is a logging bill, but the a lot of nonprofits are afraid to touch it because of an equity because it uses the cloak of equity to try and in my view facilitate a resource land grab, and it's doing it in the name of Alaska Natives, even though they would lose access to this land too. And in some of these communities, you're talking about potentially a dozen total shareholders. So you're talking about making a few millionaires and seeing massive amounts of intact ancient forests logged.
Yeah, so obviously this is a difficult topic when it comes into indigenous rights, and I'll admit it definitely makes me uncomfortable. And of course, we can't speak for indigenous people. We were hoping to have Wanda Culp on the podcast as she couldn't make it today, but hoping to speak to her in the future so we can get her perspective. But let me just ask, so is there opposition amongst some Native Americans to these logging proposals besides Wanda?
There certainly are, but you have to understand in these rural Alaskan communities, it is very hard to go against um, the the powers that be, as it were. um, there's certainly a lot of support for these bills because if you were potentially going to be a shareholder, you're talking about getting getting free money essentially, and at the same time, there are many people who rely on these forests, and you have a lot of existing, the tribal governments in Southeast Alaska, they don't have any land, and they don't have a say on how the corporate lands are managed. So there's that dynamic as well, where there's not very much vocal opposition, but there is a lot of silent opposition to this bill because it would just facilitate a status quo where, tribal governments and tribal communities don't actually have a say over how these lands are managed. And at the same time, when these areas are logged, you have you have loss of access. You have, can no longer hunt deer in those areas because the deer populations have collapsed because of the logging. You have, loss of salmon. It's a loss of the forest, but these corporations have a very big role in culture as well because these corporations will sponsor a lot of cultural events and you know almost act as tribal governments in some capacities. So it's very hard for people to feel like they want to speak out against this. So Wanda's a bit of a black sheep because she is willing to say the unpopular thing that or not even the unpopular thing, just the taboo thing that, maybe we shouldn't be doing this. I mean, there's a really tragic film produced by the Hoona Indian Association. So that's the tribe in Hoona, um, back in the early 2000s or 1990s, and it's on YouTube. It's called Hoona's Legacy. And it talks about, it shows quotes from the regional corporations, the Sealaska Corporation, talking about how, you know, we're intertwined with the land and the land is sacred and we take stewardship, very seriously. And it shows the 20,000 acres of old growth that was clear cut from Hoona, around Hoona from the 1980s into the early 2000s. And Wanda very beautifully tells a story of how she went back up there and like the elders in her village were crying because it's like, look what they are doing to this place. All of these areas that, they used to fish in and they used to gather in, they're all being ravaged in their own names. And it's a very undertold story, but it's something that I think more people need to deal with the uncomfortability of the situation because if people don't do that, industry, and in this case, Lisa Murkowski, the senator from Alaska, is using that cynically as a way to facilitate logging because Alaska's delegation is really pro logging, pro mining, pro any kind of development. And that's the reason they support this bill. And even I think some environmental groups are under the impression that this wouldn't result in logging, but every time this has happened in the past, and it has happened in 2014, there was a similar bill on 70 or on about 70,000 acres. A lot of environmental groups supported that, and those areas were subsequently logged. So it's not as cut and dry as it is in the lower 48, but it is it is something that I think it's more important to pay attention to and to learn about because it is so complicated.
Yeah, for sure. And it is certainly complicated. I mean, at Eco Integrity Alliance, we, of course, do not support any form of industrial extraction or any form of extraction, commercial or otherwise, on quote public lands, however you want to frame that. At the same time, we do have something that we call our Eco Integrity Alliance's statement of support for Indigenous peoples and land. So, of course, that's a really important piece. We talk about the crucial effort to integrate the input and traditional knowledge of Indigenous cultures. And we say the voices of Indigenous people who believe in protecting and restoring nature be central to this revitalized movement. We must do all we can to help broadcast this Earth-centric message about the U.S. environmental community while supporting Native Americans' struggle to safeguard ancestral lands from government and industry extraction, i.e., land back. But when you give lands away to what are effectively corporations to do industrial extraction, yeah, that doesn't quite pass the sniff test.
It really doesn't, and that is sort of I mean, that is the entire point. That's how it was set up. It was set up so that you're a corporation. The only way you're allowed to measure success is through financial returns. That is that's the whole organizing philosophy. So you can't just say, "Oh, we're gonna not worry about that and we're gonna protect that," because you're in in the sort of messed up world of finance. You're basically a fiduciary trust where you have a fiduciary responsibility to your shareholders, and if you don't fulfill that fiduciary responsibility, you're not fulfilling your role and you're liable to be sued or to be removed from your position. And it is possible, for instance, that you also have some areas that end up being tourism, hunting lodges, that kind of thing. You could have like you could do some other things with these lands. You could do carbon credits on some areas, but if you look at these land selections, the original Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act said the lands had to be compact and contiguous with the actual native communities. This bill cherry picks land that's literally hundreds of miles in some cases, over 100 miles away from the communities that are supposedly going to be receiving these lands. Um, and they do that because of timber volume. So when you look at what they're actually, targeting, there's actually areas where they recently did land exchanges with other privatized entities, and those areas are getting logged. And now, literally, these land selections are adjacent to that at the end of the road, so they can extend the road in and log those areas. Um, yeah, it's a hard one, but there is no justice in corporations. Corporations are the problem, they're not the solution. And if there is concern about outstanding native claims, why don't you give land why you know here's the thing. If you were to attach a language to this legislation saying all of the land will be given to these corporations, but it will be perpetually protected and will pay you the value of that conservation easement. If we were to do that, Alaska's congressional delegation would not support the legislation because that's what they're here for. So that's the simple truth. So it's not about land back, it's about land for corporations. And for a delegation that spent so long trying to repeal the roadless rule, this has been their workaround. And in Southeast Alaska, over the past 15 years, you've had almost 100,000 acres of public land given to corporations. A lot of that has been roadless acres. Tens of thousands of acres have been roadless. And while the roadless rule has kind of swung back and forth constantly, those roadless areas have very much been logged. And those are so far the only roadless areas since 2001 in the Tongass to have like meaningful amounts of logging in them.
Yeah. Yeah, sadly, this is not a unique situation, this kind of greenwashing of corporate extraction, and people realize that they can appeal to people's, of course, good nature of Native Americans have been unfairly treated like no other people, and are a lot of folks are in search of, their land back. But this is, of course, how many would frame what colonialism is. It is this endless extraction of land. So it's a greenwashing in a sense. It's a way of making people, who have genuine sympathy and empathy for Native Americans, as we all should, and do everything we can to make sure they can access ancestral land, but then twisting it and being like, but we're just going to do more industrial extraction. And this way they can kind of get away with it, the corporations or the government rather, they can get away with it because it is a kind of greenwashing. And what's happening in Oregon right now, there is a similar piece where, so this is the headline from the U.S. Forest Service, euphemism alert. So Forest Service Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians sign shared stewardship agreement to advance forest and rangeland restoration in Oregon. It's got all these nice words in here, right? Like, well, the Umpqua tribe, well, that's great. Stewardship sounds good. Forest restoration, wow. But then you look through it and it's like, oh, it is logging over 155,000 acres. So Forest Service and the tribe will work together to increase the pace and scale of forest management projects. Of course, and down here, it's all in the name of wildfire. So this seems to be a new scheme. And I don't think they're using the threat of wildfire up there, right? This is just other reasoning.
Yeah, there isn't really wildfire in this part of the world. So luckily they don't have that as a tool in their back pocket. They are just saying, "Oh no, these corporations, they won't log. This is a justice issue. They want this land to steward it." And it's like, give me a break. You can go look on satellite imagery. There's a place called the Cleveland Peninsula that was given to Sealaska. That was like 5 or 6 thousand acres contiguously of old growth, of roadless old growth. It was the only Cleveland Peninsula's hundreds of thousands of acres of forest, and none of it had ever been logged. And then this chunk was given to Sealaska, all got logged. So it's an increasingly common tool. And I spend a lot of my time working around Fairy Creek up in British Columbia. And this is the way that industry uses, like this is what they use at the 11th hour to say, checkmate. You can't oppose this. You said you wanted land back, so here you go, and we're logging it. And oftentimes, I think the Alaska example is very cut and dry because it is corporations, not even tribal governments. There's no democratic control. It's shareholder. I mean, there's democratic control by shareholders, except that all you really need is, a lot of the shareholders of these corporations don't even live in Alaska. They just benefit from the checks. So when you have that incentive, it's very, very unlikely, even if you had motivated shareholders for areas not to be logged. But in British Columbia, the industry is using that as well to push forward pipelines, push forward a liquid natural gas facility. There was the premier of British Columbia recently had a whole press conference where he said, this is the right kind of liquid natural gas exporting facility because it is, done with First Nations investment and First Nations consent. And it's like, and it's still going to cook the planet. And, most communities are susceptible to financial incentives. And if you are a rural community and you want financial activity, like then you're probably going to go for really horrible resource extraction projects. And it's on us to offer an alternative as the federal government. And it's like if it is true that and this is kind of in contention that there were any communities that were actually left out of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act because these communities were accounted for in that act. They simply received shares in different corporations instead of having their own corporations. So it's a little bit of a, well, were you really left out? But the claim is that, okay, these communities were left out. Even if that's true, why are we rating public lands as the piggy bank? Because this is about shareholder dividends. So why don't we just give them money for shareholder dividends? Like, let's skip the rating of public lands part of it. And if you want to do a real land back project that's actually going to protect the land, how about we give it to tribal governments instead of corporations? But, that I think that just shows you how much of a scam it is.
Yeah, and clearly this is a crucial issue, and we'll talk shortly about how people can take action on this. But hopefully, the more this gets out there, and more maybe that Indigenous people realize they will have support if they raise their voices in concern. So hopefully, there'll be more Indigenous folks like Wanda willing to speak for the lands and waters, wild creatures, and for the tribes themselves, because liquidation of land is not a benefit to anyone, much less the tribes. And the argument of, well, this is in keeping with the traditions of the tribe. It's like, yeah, the traditional feller bunchers. It's ridiculous, right? It's an offensive argument, I would argue, and they are making it down here, saying in some cases that because there has been some traditional, more lighter touch practices on the land, say through a little bit of burning and hunting areas and around settlements, therefore that industrial clear cutting, like deep in the forest, is somehow in keeping. Like that's just offensive. And some call it cultural misappropriation. It's not even cultural appropriation because that wasn't their culture at all.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And it's a bit Orwellian. I mean, the whole industry is Orwellian. You're hearing about variable retention logging, you're hearing about restoration, and it's all degradation. And in Alaska, the language is all around stewardship, of ancestral lands, and it all sounds very nice. Like, oh, you're going to steward it. Great, responsible management. And then you go out there and you're like, holy shit, they clear cut every single tree except for the one the eagle was nesting in, and that's about it. And you really need to watch this film because you see areas where they've logged coastlines. They've logged like beaches with emerald pools, like some of the most beautiful, stunning places in the world, and you'll log right to the shoreline. And that's what not only native corporations are doing in Alaska, but you also have the University of Alaska. They have trust lands that were granted to them. They're logging like that. That's what some of those clear cuts in the film are. And you also have the Alaska Mental Health Trust, believe it or not. They clear cut old growth forests to produce sort of minimal revenue for mental health care. And this is all in the context where the industry in Southeast Alaska consists of like a couple of dozen people because almost all of the logging that happens up there is exported to China. Like immediately, it's there's a company called Alcan. They do these large scale logging projects. They actually import contractors from Washington State. So I was up there and I saw, logging trucks with Washington plates from Port Angeles, which was a bit of a shock to me. And most of that is exported to Asia, and then a small portion of it, usually the logging off of the national forest, which is now ramping up as well, that goes to a small mill called Viking, which has, I think it's about 20 full-time employees employed in the forest industry in all of Southeast Alaska. So it's a ridiculously low number. And in the case of U.S. Forest Service timber sales, there's one coming up called the South Ravilla Project, and that would log 4,000 acres of old growth, 60 million board feet. And we are actually, as taxpayers, paying them to do that. We're not making money off of it. We are literally paying for that to happen. And really, you have this whole bureaucracy in the Forest Service out there where, you have a bunch of bureaucrats and they need something to do, so they do timber sales. And it's one of those things where the agency is perpetuating itself up there. And then on the private lands, you just have literally cut and run and export it to Asia right away.
Yeah, well, that's not a surprise to me who's really benefiting from this. But yeah, I've been reading a lot of books about indigenous people and the various tribes' connection and reverence to the land, which can really differ based on the region and tribe. And both to support Native Americans and rights and lost rights, but also to figure out the way forward for what the so-called environmental movement could be, right? Because there is so much we can learn from Native peoples. So let me just ask this really clear. Can you support the rights of Native people and the land back movement and also oppose this landless bill?
Absolutely. Because I think that as environmentalists, we need to be out and proud about having biocentric values, which biocentrism is kind of the white guy term for indigenous values. It's you care about the land's right to exist. And that doesn't mean that you don't necessarily, kill things sometimes. Like people need to eat. People need to, you know, in either build a house or whatever. Like if you have a biocentric relationship to the land, it doesn't mean you can't participate in the life cycle of the land where you you interact with the greater life that's there, but it means you don't see yourself as the supreme lord of that land that gets to say, you know, the the 20 billion little tiny organisms living in this massive hillside, yeah, they don't matter. We want dividends. That is not biocentric. That is a profoundly fucked up value system that we have, and that white people, we're still operating under a colonial system that Europeans brought. Like capitalism is colonial, and that supremely twisted ideology is pernicious, and that is what has been deliberately pushed by government onto indigenous people. It's the same thing um, as a lot of the economic development that the U.S. tries to pursue overseas, or up until recently did. It's pushing, um, you know, communities living off of the land into global capitalism, and I think that you know people need to be very comfortable speaking for the land, even if that appears to contradict with with proposals like this, where you know on the surface it could be said, well, why aren't you standing with indigenous people who want their land back? And for sure, it could be said that, but you also have to look at what will happen to that land. And if you have a relationship to the land, a biocentric relationship, if you care for the other creatures on that land, and you know full well what will happen to it if it's transferred to these corporations, you can't do anything but fight for these areas. I mean, for me, I go to so many different forests that are at risk of being logged, and I've been to a lot of these land selections, and hands down, some of the most stunning places on Earth. They have Sitka spruce and red cedar trees that are 500 to 1,000 years old, and these areas they look exactly the same now as they did 1,000 years ago, and that is something that's miraculous. And I think we need to have our loyalty first and foremost to the land. And ultimately, I think that biocentric viewpoint is the most aligned with indigenous values. And I'm certainly going to pursue that, no matter how sort of challenging it is to navigate, because what's the alternative? Do we just turn away like the Nature Conservancy and like the Wilderness Society are doing and say, oh well, we are going to have some wishful thinking that somehow these corporations won't do what corporations do, even though that's what they've done in the past, emphasizing that like we know what happens when these lands get privatized. Or are we going to be realistic, and are we going to fight with everything we've got to protect these places? And it's not too late. I mean, this bill has been introduced to Congress multiple times, and the reason we're so I guess worked up about it right now is because just recently the House Democrats leadership are supporting the bill, and it recently advanced out of committee in the House for the first time in history. It had a hearing in the Senate. It could legitimately pass, and we need to be extremely clear that old growth logging is wrong. Period. End of story. And we need to block anything that would enable, in this case, the largest industrial logging project in the Pacific temperate rainforest, potentially this century. I mean, this is a huge amount of forest we're talking about, and we're not talking about a little bit of logging. We're talking about all of it potentially being clear cut.
Yeah, and we're going to certainly expedite this episode so it gets out there so people can take action. And we're going to include info for how to do so, but maybe you can just remind people about what they should be doing if they care about this.
Well, the first thing I think you want to educate yourself, right? So there's this new documentary that's just been released, and it's available until May 22nd, and it's free. So that's at landlessfilm.com, and definitely check that out. Um, and on that page, there are also a lot action alerts. The John Muir Project has an action alert where you can look up your representative. It's very important that you contact your representatives and your senators, especially your senators, because we think that the Senate is the place where we can actually block this bill. And ideally, give them a call directly and say you don't support this legislation. It's currently the info is all on that website, but it's House Bill 41 and Senate Bill S2554. And House Bill 41, like it is ready to pass the House. It's been out of committee, so it is, that's very imminent. So we need as many people as possible to watch this film, educate themselves on the bill, and take action. And spread the word because as I said earlier, a lot of the bigger environmental groups, they are simply you'll see action alerts about any number of things, but they won't tell you that a bill like this is about to go through, which equates to a 100,000 acre logging bill of old growth. And if that was happening, if that was a Forest Service project, you would be hearing all of these environmental groups yelling at the top of their lungs about clear-cut logging 80,000 acres of old growth. But you don't hear that because it's a land privatization bill. Um, and yeah, we need as many people to speak up and to share and to spread the word as possible.
Absolutely, and really glad that you're doing so. Definitely going to keep interfacing with Wanda and trying to get her on to get her perspective. And we definitely have had on a few other Indigenous people to the podcast. We've had people from Sacred Defense Fund and Lakota Law Project. So definitely want to have their voices. But yeah, the biocentric approach, it's the land, the air, the waters first. And without speaking for Indigenous people, that seems to be a lot of the tribes and cultures' view on things. So maybe, like I said, if more folks out there are saying, hey, we have concerns like this that may encourage others like Wanda to speak up, knowing people have their back. So that's what we're here to do. We're here to get that perspective out there. And there are room for a lot of views on these things, but yeah, the pushing down of information, the censorship of it, the greenwashing of it, that's what we're really against here at the Green Root Podcast and Eco Integrity Alliance. We believe the facts should be out there to speak for themselves. And from our perspective, that's exactly what you're doing. And so just want to thank you for that. It's not an easy topic to take a stand on. A lot of my listeners may realize I am extremely outspoken on everything. I stick my neck out on almost everything, and I get my head chopped off a fair amount. This topic, I will admit, does make me a little uncomfortable because it is that juxtaposition of two things that I do care about, which are rights of Indigenous people and rights of nature. And I don't think that they are at cross purposes, but the powers that be, the industry and government, what I call the clear-cut cult, or others can call the extractors, they are intentionally manipulating those issues to get people to stay silent, to make it so you do get beat up if you speak up on this. So I just want to commend you for speaking up, and you are working with folks like Wanda. So it's not like you are just out there with your own perspective alone. That this is obviously the perspective of folks like Wanda. It's also the perspective of the land, and that's the way I look at everything. It's like if the land could speak, in this case, English, what would it say? And I would say it would probably say what you are saying.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I didn't choose to like get into this because I saw this bill and was like, oh, that's what I want to spend my time working on. It's the fact that you're not hearing anybody else talk about it. And I'm in touch with folks in Southeast Alaska and literally have, Wanda and there's a few great fishermen and fisherwomen from Petersburg that I know who've been stalwart forest defenders for a long time. And they, for years they've been saying this is the sleeping dragon. And I first saw those clear cuts when I was really young. From the last time they did this in 2014, it was 70,000 acres, and if I was there filming my documentary Eden's Last Chance, which came out a few years ago, and a pilot had seen the clear cutting and wanted to take me up there, so she flew me in her little plane over this just entire landscape, like over ridge tops, through valleys, and it felt like I was in like Hiroshima or something. It felt like a bomb had gone off or sorry about that. It felt like a bomb had gone off because every direction you looked was just devastation. And I remember thinking to myself, how many trillions of organisms lived in that landscape? And and if they could speak, they would not care that it's not comfortable to do so. And I think that we need to fight for what's left. And I think that there's not enough old growth forest to turn a blind eye because once they are given to corporations, these aren't, corporations, they don't have they don't have any values. Their only value is a fiduciary value. And when you have forests and your value is money, that generally ends in logging, or if you're lucky, it ends in carbon credits where British Petroleum gets to go drill in the Arctic and the forest get saved for 100 years. But that's a best case scenario, and that's a pretty bad scenario as well.
Yeah, well, once again, I want to commend you because you are somewhat of an online influencer. Maybe you wouldn't call yourself that, but you're a filmmaker. So you you are doing quite well on social media and you have a large following. And here's what I really, really respect. There are a lot of folks who do environmental, say online influencing or even around public land stuff. And they are really just about the views, likes, clicks, praise, and sponsors. And they almost always shy away from the most controversial stuff. They will maybe in their hearts be like, this is an important issue, but I'm not going to talk about this because I might lose some subscribers. I might stir up some controversy. So they end up really more and more, not always, but often gravitating towards fluff. You're taking the other direction. You're going into the belly of the beast here. You're tackling the sleeping dragon, as you mentioned. And I just want to say that does take a lot of courage. You could probably make fluffier videos and get more likes and attention and pats on the back, but you're not. So I just want to say, I see that you're doing this. I see that you are being guided by your heart and spirit and are doing that work of speaking for the land, air, water, and creatures. So I just want to thank you for that.
Well, it's exactly what you say. If the land could speak, what would it say? And to me, that's all I really care about. And, you know, I have all these memories of, intact valleys of forests that aren't here anymore. And I feel like those memories of ancient ancestor organisms that are gone from this earth for, thousands of years after they're cut down. Like I feel like those memories give you a responsibility to stick your neck out. And, I'm not an activist to make friends, I'm an activist to save forests.
Well, good on you. Same here. And last question before we let you go. At the Green Root Podcast, we're all about some of the root causes of the eco crisis. So I want to ask you, what do you believe is a root cause of, if not the eco crisis itself, an aspect of the eco crisis? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would have to say, it honestly, industrial civilization itself is the root cause. I don't think we can say, oh, I mean, it is a collective action problem. There are so many different layers to it, but I don't see a way that we can innovate ourselves out of the climate crisis. I think that um, everything comes from somewhere, and we're in a technological civilization, industrial civilization that relies on global supply chains. You can't have global supply chains without fossil fuels. And I think that system is built on a um, kind of the Judeo-Christian framework of human supremacism, where you in the Bible it says, God gave man dominion over the earth, and dominion means you get to do whatever you want. There's other people that interpret that as it gives you caretaking roles, and if you want to interpret that way, that's a beautiful way to live, but that's not the way we've interpreted it. We've interpreted it as, we are boss and we get to do whatever we want because we are in charge. And I think that there's some really beautiful, like the work of Daniel Quinn and Ishmael, where he talks about, maybe we could see our role as the creature that realizes that we could destroy the world and decides not to, and by doing so become the caretaker of life. And that's what I hope. But I do think that it really roots back to this idea of dominion over nature, where we are, we perceive, even most environmentalists, even most, I think, people who are label themselves progressive, it's like, if you could, have a human community die or 100,000 acres clear cut, which would you choose? And to me, the biocentric worldview says you have to support the systems of life because that is what matters in the long run. But I think we place such a value on even one person that we would rather one person live than an entire ancient forest. And that imbalance, I think, is fundamentally arrogant and is something that we need to change. Um, and it's certainly a minority view, but there it is.
Well, definitely agree with that. Definitely appreciate that. And thanks for all you're doing.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so glad to have you here.